Under Operation Warp Speed, we are poised to have vaccine for 20 million Americans before the end of December. It is truly a medical miracle and an inspiration to people across this country.
20 million, that's just 18 days away. You have 2.9 million going out right now. That doesn't seem possible, does it?
I think it's possible. I certainly heard those discussions, and I think that's a reasonable prediction, and I have confidence around that.
So you still expect to vaccinate 20 million people by the end of the month, even though you just shipped out 3 million doses this week?
Oh, sure. Yes. So we'll be getting more and more Pfizer product, and we've got a 12.5 million of Moderna product, assuming that we get approval at the end of this week on Moderna that will ship out very soon thereafter. So 20 million vaccinations this month.
Promises, so many promises. The Trump administration has been pledging vaccinations for 20 million Americans by the end of December. December ends tomorrow. And yesterday, the CDC reported that 11.4 million doses have been sent to states, and only about 2.1 million people have received the vaccine's first dose.
Well, we certainly are not at the numbers that we wanted to be at the end of December. You heard talking about 40 million doses for 20 million people. I mean, even if you undercount 2 million as an undercount, how much undercount could it be? So we are below where we want to be.
All right. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Wednesday, December 30th. I'm Casey Hunt alongside White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire. We are once again in for Joe, Mika, and Willie as we wrap up this really hard year. And with us this morning, we have Republican strategist and senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, Susan Del Percio, and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and the president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. John, it is pretty incredible to watch all of those comments from White House officials over the last couple of months, making these promises, saying they're going to get this out the door, only to be where we are here with just one more day, one and a half more days left in 2020. The Trump administration has to be on the defensive about this, and they've been under attack from the Biden transition even.
First, let's grab the good news piece of that sentence. We're in the penultimate day of 2020. This terrible year almost over. But you're right, Casey. This is a president, as we've been documenting morning after morning, who has largely checked out, who has abandoned his day job and his responsibilities, particularly when it comes to battling this pandemic that is surging throughout the country and has claimed more than 100,000 lives just since Election Day. But one thing that was supposed to be a signature achievement was the development and rollout and distribution of this vaccine. You saw the clips there. The promises were bold. They were strong. And at least to this point, they haven't been met. And we're going to get into this much more in a moment. There's been extraordinarily strong pushback from the White House, trying to be defensive about this, from the president himself, from the press secretary, from administration officials, trying to suggest that this vaccine rollout is happening as planned, even though we know that not as many Americans are receiving this as nearly as they hoped. But of course, the other drama that we're following right now, Casey, and I know you're watching so very closely, is Capitol Hill. We saw some pretty dramatic stuff on the floor yesterday. Can you walk us through the machinations and the plotting, perhaps, that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been doing?
As dramatic as the Senate floor can ever be. I mean, John, we've been talking about this all week, and the way that President Trump has suddenly decided that he's going to push these $2,000 checks. And we should remind everyone, if this is what the president wanted, he could have had it. He just would have needed to say so during any of the months that these negotiations were going on. But now he's insisting, OK, I want to vote on this. And it's left Mitch McConnell in a position of trying to defend the two senators that are running for re-election in Georgia. They both have said they want $2,000 checks. But it's pretty clear so many other Republicans are opposed to it. And so he's come up with this strategy, and he's basically laying it back at the feet of the president, right? He's saying, well, President Trump tied these three issues together when he actually gave in, signed that COVID relief bill. And those issues are related to tech liability, or liability for tech companies, I should say, as well as an election fraud commission. And basically what happens, you package all those things together and then you cannot get the support for the $2,000 checks, even though there is incredibly broad support for it in Congress. The House passed it by a 2/3 vote. And that, of course, I think really underscores as we head into the new year how difficult it is. And I keep thinking about the people who just are watching what is happening and they're saying, my life is so hard because of this pandemic and you, Congress, can't get it together. But this is often how they deal with things like this. And this is how McConnell has been doing it, John.
It's sort of regular business, and I'm sure we know the partnership between Mitch McConnell and President Trump has remade in many ways the federal judiciary, and there's a lot of conservative goals that accomplished. But one has to wonder if in private moments the Senate Majority Leader also counting down the days to January 20th. At least his job will have more clarity. We're going to revisit that shortly. But first, back to the matter of the vaccinations and the struggles this administration has had getting to the Americans who need them. And they're receiving a lot of criticism, including from President-elect Joe Biden. He spoke yesterday, again urging Americans to wear a mask and calling on President Trump to set that example in his final days in office. And he also called Trump out for his handling of the vaccine distribution.
The Trump administration's plan to distribute vaccines is falling behind, far behind. This will take more time than anyone would like and more time than the promises from the Trump administration have suggested. This is going to be the greatest operational challenge we've ever faced as a nation, but we're going to get it done.
Likely in response to Biden's comments, Trump took to Twitter to blame the states for the vaccine distribution lag and threw out another random swine flu mention. A spokesman for Operation Warp Speed said that efforts remained on target and that the low numbers published by the CDC so far reflected a lag in reporting from local health authorities. The White House also released a statement touting the speed of the vaccine developments. And here's Assistant Secretary of Health Admiral Brett Giroir on MSNBC yesterday.
All public health works through the state and locals. The federal plan is to provide the guidance, to provide the infrastructure. You know, we're providing all the vaccines, the distribution mechanisms, the needles, the alcohol swabs. But it's really a state and local level to get vaccines in arms, like it always is. Every year, 170 million flu shots. That's done at the local level. The federal government doesn't invade Texas or Montana and provide shots to people. We support the state and locals in doing that.
Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Jeff Bennett reporting this morning on the Biden transition in beautiful Wilmington, Delaware. Jeff, great to see you. Walk us through yesterday the argument that the president-elect is making and specifically the complaints that he is voicing about both the vaccine distribution, but also the obstacles that his team is facing as they are about to inherit this problem in just 3 weeks from today.
Yeah. And Jonathan, what's so interesting about this pushback from the White House is that Admiral Brett Giroir just really explained the crux of the issue. The administration is basically saying that they're responsible for the distribution of these vaccines, but the states are responsible for the vaccinations. Well, as we well know, states are stretched thin. They are cash-strapped now 10 months into this pandemic, and what they're looking for is stronger federal intervention. It was the same thing with testing. The administration kept saying for months that more test kits are being rolled out to states, but yet we knew that the tests weren't actually being administered, and it was because the states needed more help from the federal government. And so what we heard from Joe Biden yesterday was not a plan to get vaccines distributed, it was a plan to get vaccines into the arms of Americans. He talked about how he would invoke the Defense Production Act to ramp up the production of vaccines, but also the protective gear that's needed to administer it. He called for additional funding from Congress so that the states could get the money they need to really stand up a fulsome vaccination effort. He even talked about creating vaccination sites, federally backed vaccination sites, and having mobile units that would be sent out to hard-to-reach parts of the country. And then beyond all that, he talked about having a public messaging campaign to boost vaccine acceptance. And so this was really, for 2 days straight, we saw Joe Biden call out the administration. Earlier this week, it was about the roadblocks, as he put it, that the Pentagon, the Trump appointees at the Pentagon were putting up so that his Trump administration, that the Biden transition officials didn't have a good enough view into the force posture of the military all around the world. And yesterday he was talking about how the Trump administration has fallen short of this vaccine rollout. So, you know, Joe Biden becomes President Biden in something like, 21 days. and he is articulating the problems, the challenges that the country faces and that he will inherit as commander-in-chief, Jonathan and Casey.
So, Reverend Al, I was just struck watching as we came in there with that long list of promises from these administration officials. They have really gotten Americans' hopes up over the course of the last couple of weeks. Everyone, or months really, everyone has been desperate for this pandemic to come to an end. And those officials have been out there saying, don't worry, it's coming. We got this. But they're setting in some ways expectations for the Biden administration that are just being set up to fail. Do you think that's part of what's going on here? And what is the challenge for the Biden team?
Well, the challenge for the Biden team is to give a realistic projection on what can be delivered. Whether this is a setup or not, it in effect will be acting as a setup if the Biden team does not give realistic expectations, be able to deliver on them. And if we are not successful in challenging the federal government to give the states what they need to operate. One of the arguments on Capitol Hill, and you know this better than anyone, has been aids to the states who are already operating in deficits. And if the federal government under President Trump is saying that it's not us, it's the states, but then they're not giving the states the kind of revenue and support that they need, it really falls back on them, and they will pass it off to Biden and be the first one blaming Biden on January 21st. The day after the inauguration, they will make it his problem.
We saw an extraordinary amount of defensiveness from the Trump administration on this yesterday, Jeff, including saying that they have invoked the DPA, which we should remind viewers was a Korean War era measure that gives the president authority to compel American industries to boost production for a war effort, in this case, a vaccine effort. But Joe Biden and his team is saying that, no, we're the ones who are going to step forward and really use the DPA. Can you explain sort of the discrepancy here? What does the Trump administration talk about? How have they used this measure before? And what specifically do we think the Biden team is going to do in order to get to use that measure to get the vaccines to the Americans who need them?
So the Trump administration invoked the Defense Production Act to ramp up the production of PPE, to ramp up the production of nasal swabs. And so the president used that 1950s era law really as it relates more to the testing kits and the rollout of a testing strategy such that it existed. The administration really has not used that for vaccine production in the way that the Biden transition is talking about doing as it relates to the vaccination rollout. And so there's also an issue with producing the raw materials needed to actually produce the vaccines. And so that is where the Defense Production Act, Biden transition officials say, could be particularly useful, Jonathan.
NBC's Jeff Bennett, thank you so much. Enjoy the day in Delaware. Casey, this is certainly going to be a monumental challenge for the Biden team as they come in, one that they're starting behind the game. And certainly the urgency will only increase as we see these numbers of Americans dying rise sharply and are expected to surge even more in cases of infections after the Christmas holidays.
Yeah, those warnings, of course, that January is likely to be the toughest month that we've seen yet, even as we have this hope of a vaccine. And to that point, a newly elected member of Congress has died from complications related to the coronavirus. Luke Letlow, a Republican from Louisiana who was just 41 years old, was set to take office on Sunday. The entire Louisiana delegation, as well as Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader McCarthy, all offered condolences to Letlow's family. He leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. Letlow announced he was diagnosed less than 2 weeks ago on December 18th, and just a few days later, he was hospitalized and later transferred to another hospital. It is not believed that Letlow had any underlying conditions. Our thoughts are with his family today, and we're going to get much more on the coronavirus pandemic from Dr. Naheed Bhadelia in just a few moments. But we do want to go now to politics in Georgia, where an audit of the state's absentee ballots has found no evidence of fraud. More than 15,000 randomly chosen absentee ballot envelopes in Metro Atlanta's Cobb County were reviewed for this report. There were 10 ballots that were initially flagged as being unsigned or having mismatched signatures. But investigators later confirmed that they were, in fact, legitimately cast by the voters who returned them. And the audit ultimately confirmed a 99% confidence level in the presidential election results after 2 recounts, both by hand and by machine. Still, President Trump continued to rail against Georgia Republicans, tweeting last night, quote, "I love the great state of Georgia, but the people who run it, from the governor to the secretary of state, are a complete disaster and don't have a clue, or worse. Nobody can be this stupid." Trump then proceeded to touch on some type of conspiracy that Raffensperger's brother works for China, which somehow connects to what he says is going on in Georgia. There is only one small problem with this. Brad Raffensperger does not even have a brother, as has been pointed out by many on social media. According to Newsweek, Trump is likely referring to Ron Raffensperger, who is the CTO of the Chinese technology firm Huawei. The two men are not, in fact, related. Susan Del Percio, we are in the final days of this, we are seeing these conspiracy theories continue to spiral. Brad Raffensperger has been the subject of threats to himself, to his family members, all for the ostensible crime of telling the truth about this election. And the president will just not let this go. And when is enough enough?
For President Trump, it's never enough. And he will continue to live out these delusional fantasies that somehow he's going to change the election results. The results are in. Biden won. Donald Trump lost. He lost Georgia 3 times, once on Election Day and 2 other recounts. But what does concern me is the talk of violence and the talk of getting revenge and speaking out against people in such a divisive way, especially when we look towards next week when the Electoral College will be certified. And Donald Trump is urging people to come to Washington and saying it's going to be a crazy time. And the Proud Boys we talked about in your show, Casey, they are now banned from their hotel where they typically gather. But they caused a lot of violence 3 weeks ago, including several stabbings. And Donald Trump encourages this behavior. And that's what's truly dangerous. I mean, I laugh when I hear about the brother that, doesn't exist and saying, oh, that's just Trump being Trump. But then he takes it a step to a point where people's lives are in danger. And this is what he's focusing on. We now look at almost approaching 340,000 deaths. And Donald Trump is focused on losing yet another court battle and who he can go out and rant and rave about. And just looking at Georgia, is this the person you want coming to Georgia the day before your election and, quote, supporting you? I think he's going to cause a lot of problems for Republicans in Georgia on January 4th.
I strongly suspect that Hugo Chavez knows the location of the Georgia Secretary of State's non-existent brother. Reverend Sharpton, this, of course, the president's latest conspiracy theories, his latest attacks on the great state of Georgia, come less than a week before the Senate runoff election there. And the president is heading to Georgia in a matter of days for a rally. And I'm sure rhetoric like this makes a lot of Republicans rather nervous. So give us your assessment, week out. What's the state of play from what you're hearing on the ground in Georgia? I should note that one of the Democratic candidates, Jon Ossoff, will be a guest on this show just in a little bit. What's your sense of it? The enthusiasm that carried Joe Biden to capture Georgia, the first Democrat to take that state in decades, is that going to be able to be recreated here, Rev? But we've heard, Casey and I have both heard, that operatives on both sides of this race, Democrats, Republicans alike, believe it's a close race, but might say slight advantage to the GOP right now.
There is a lot of enthusiasm on the ground, as I can attest to from talking to people throughout the state. National Action Network, my group, has an office in Atlanta. There's a lot going on the ground. But there is also a lot of pushback by the Republicans. There is clearly going to be a close race. And I think that the behavior or misbehavior of Donald Trump on the night before could be very decisive in a race this close. But I think that Ossoff and Reverend Warnock has really put together a great ground game and may be able to pull off the enthusiasm in terms of delivering their vote that Biden got. And Stacey Abrams and others are to be given credit for that. But I think it's too close to call.
Of course, we're going to ask John Ossoff about all of this coming up later on the show. And still ahead here on Morning Joe, the United States confirms its first case of the new coronavirus strain that has been spreading rapidly across the UK. We're going to have the very latest on the pandemic. Plus, the Wall Street Journal editorial board continues its criticism of President Trump. We're going to take a look at the latest piece that argues Mitch McConnell is trying to, quote, minimize the harm from a vengeful Trump. You're watching Morning Joe. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
We are not here to curse the darkness. We are here to light a candle.
I'm Chuck Rosenberg. On my podcast, The Oath, I talk with people who served with integrity and honor, men and women who light the way. This week, former New Zealand Police Commissioner Mike Bush.
Particularly with first-time offenders, you want to give them a chance. You don't want to automatically put them on that justice cycle where they end up in jail. If you can intervene with a young person, do something different, and send them on a different path, that's why you come to work.
Join me for Season 4 of The Oath, an MSNBC podcast. Search for The Oath wherever you're listening right now and subscribe. New episodes every Wednesday.
2 Georgia Senate seats at stake. Control of the Senate on the line.
If Republicans win one of those or both of those, they stay in charge in the U.S. Senate.
Rachel Maddow, Brian Williams, and Steve Kornacki will break down the results county by county.
The challenge for Democrats is to try to get to Biden levels of turnout and support.
With analysis from Joy Reid and Nicole Wallace. Georgia runoffs fight for the Senate. Tuesday at 7 on MSNBC.
New developments overnight in the fight against the coronavirus as the British drug maker AstraZeneca's vaccine candidate received regulatory approval in the United Kingdom. Some good news here. The vaccine, made in collaboration with Oxford University, comes 3 weeks after the UK became the first nation to roll out the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. The vaccine is considered vital for vaccination efforts in developing countries because it's cheaper to make and it's easier to store for long periods of time because it requires only normal refrigeration temperatures to remain viable. So that makes distribution quite a bit easier. The British Health Secretary said the first doses would be administered on January 4th. John?
2020 is not done with us yet, Casey. For the first time in the United States, a case of the new coronavirus variant has been found. Initially seen in the UK, it has been reported, adding urgency to the efforts to vaccinate Americans. The variant was reported in Colorado after being found in a man in his 20s who was in isolation southeast of Denver in Elbert County. According to state health officials, he had no travel history. Scientists in the UK believe the variant is more contagious than previously identified strains. The discovery sparked border closures in European countries like Ireland, France, Belgium, and Germany, as well as countries outside of the continent. Joining us now, infectious diseases physician and medical director of the Special Pathogens Unit at the Boston University School of Medicine, Dr. Nahid Badilia. She is an NBC News and MSNBC medical contributor, I am happy to say. Doctor, thank you for being here. Good morning. Let's start right there. We sort of sensed it was only a matter of time. As soon as there were reports that this new, more contagious variant was discovered in the UK and quickly spread across other countries, that it would be found here in the U.S. Can you tell us now, if obviously this is still a new thing, but after a few weeks of study, what's the latest in terms of how contagious this disease, this strain really is, how dangerous it really is, and is there a sense that the vaccine can handle it? What should Americans know about it, and how should they prepare?
Good morning, Jonathan. So as you said, this was something that public health practitioners have been expecting, partly because we're not sequencing as many of the diagnosed cases that we're seeing here in the U.S. And so we're likely to actually see more cases being reported because we're now actively looking for it. So the UK has actually done a few different types of studies to show now that this variant is at least 60% more transmissible. What they've done is that they've shown that over the period of December, it's become sort of the predominant strain that they're diagnosing. And so after it was discovered, it became the new strain that most people are getting infected with. But they've now also done 2 other studies, one that looked at secondary infection. So what they showed was that people who had this strain were much more likely to pass it to other people around them in a case control study. And then lastly, they noticed that people who have this strain are much more likely to have a higher amount of virus in their respiratory tract, which makes it, of course, easier to transmit. So all of those things bring it together to the fact that even though we don't yet know in terms of, it doesn't look like it's likely more deadly. They haven't discovered that in the studies that the Brits have done so far. We do know that because it's more transmissible, it is likely to lead to more infections, which may eventually lead to more hospitalizations, of course, and deaths. The good news, of course, Jonathan, is that we know how to protect ourselves from this. It is to do the same things we do for every other strain, which is to wear those masks, keep that distance, to not gather in crowds, and of course, when the vaccine is available, to get vaccinated.
So, Dr. Bedelia, let's talk about the vaccine here. And we do know that the AstraZeneca vaccine operates a little bit differently than the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Are you confident that all three of these vaccines would work against this new strain? Or what do researchers know and not know about whether or not these vaccinations will still be effective against this new strain we're seeing?
Yeah, Casey, so this is the concern, right? I think that for most folks would say if you were to put a bet on it right now, it's likely the vaccines will remain effective because a number of, mutations that you might need in a virus to change the effectiveness or the efficacy of all of these vaccines would have to be much larger. However, this is something that's still being studied. The AstraZeneca has actually looked at that, and they're currently sort of, going to be reporting that, as are both Pfizer and Moderna, looking at just the mutations on the effectiveness. So we don't have complete data on that. But even if it reduces the efficacy of the vaccine by a little, I mean, most public health folks would agree that even if you saw that the vaccination efficacy went down by a little, the vaccinations themselves would still have a huge impact, public health impact, both for the individual and most people who take it, to bring the number of cases down and to keep people protected from new infections.
Doctor, what is being done to educate people on the safety of the vaccines? As you know, there's been a lot of people, particularly in communities of color, that have, based on history, suspicions about the vaccines. Now that we're hearing about even additional vaccines, it complicates matters even more. What is being done to really relieve people of the fear of even engaging in a vaccine at all once it becomes available to the general public more readily?
This is where I think I'm so glad to hear President-elect Biden talk about it yesterday, because, as you know, some amount of that relief bill that was passed on Sunday or signed on Monday or Sunday was supposed to be money for vaccine education, as well as resources to administer those vaccines at the last mile. And so I'm really glad to hear that it's passed, but there hasn't been as strong as an outreach as you'd like to see, at least from our federal government. You've seen a lot of sort of citizen scientists reaching out, and you're seeing trusted messengers coming out of the communities that are affected, which is great to see. But really, what I'd love to see is more a concerted effort, as President-elect Biden said, in terms of investing in that messaging, particularly reaching out to hard-hit communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, those that have really been disproportionately affected by this disease, and for whom these vaccinations will be particularly a relief in those communities, trying to bring those hospitalizations and deaths down.
All right, Dr. Nahid Bedelia, thank you so much, as always, for your insight and expertise here. We want to go now to some of the other stories that we are following this morning. We are learning new details about the Nashville bombers' checkered past with the police. According to documents obtained by the Tennessean, more than a year before the Christmas Day explosion that destroyed parts of downtown Nashville, officers were tipped off to the suspect reportedly making bombs. On August 21st, 2019, police visited the suspect's home after his girlfriend said he was, quote, building bombs in the RV trailer at his residence. After finding no evidence in a search of the property themselves, the officers then forwarded the information to the FBI. The FBI claims to have run the suspect's name through a database, but no further action was taken at the time. And in the aftermath of last week's destruction, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation claimed that the suspect was, quote, not on our radar prior to the bombing. Now to Louisville, where two police officers tied to the deadly raid that killed Breonna Taylor both received notice that the police department intends to fire them. Both Detective Miles Cosgrove, who was one of the officers who shot Taylor, and Detective Joshua Janes, who prepared the search warrant for the raid, were notified of their department's intentions yesterday. A lawyer for Cosgrove confirmed he received a letter of termination to NBC News, but he did not comment any further. The officers still have the right to a pre-termination hearing before they're officially fired, according to the Louisville Metropolitan Police Department. And also yesterday, the Justice Department announced that it will not bring federal criminal charges against 2 Cleveland police officers in the 2014 killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, saying video of the shooting was of too poor a quality for prosecutors to conclusively establish what had happened. The decision, revealed in a lengthy statement, doesn't condone the officers' actions, but rather says the cumulative evidence was not enough to support a federal criminal civil rights prosecution. Reverend Al, your reaction to both this decision in the Tamir Rice case and also the actions of the Louisville Police Department in the case of Breonna Taylor?
Well, the decision of the federal government not to proceed in the Tamir Rice case, 12-year-old boy with a toy gun, and you could see in the video the police jump out the car. You don't need a high-quality video to see what happened. In seconds, they shot and killed him. And for them not to proceed with a federal case is an outrage. And many of us that were involved in this particular situation only asked for a fair day in court. And they've now denied that. I think it is indicative of the Trump administration's using the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to really deny civil rights proceedings going forward and let a jury decide on evidence. And in terms of Louisville, I not only think those policemen should have been fired, I think they should have been prosecuted. They engaged in clearly going in a wrong place and killing someone who was not even guilty of being looked into for a particular situation that they were assigned to do. They should not have not only been on the force, they should be in a courtroom having to defend their actions.
Reverend Sharpton, thank you for your perspective on that. We'll shift gears when we return. Coming up, with foreign policy a delicate matter for any American president, there are additional hurdles for Joe Biden as his transition team faces resistance from the current administration. We'll break down the biggest national security concerns awaiting the president-elect. Don't go anywhere. Morning Joe will be right back.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with Josh Jezza about the absolutely mind-blowing story of Trump's Wisconsin Foxconn deal.
The company did not really have a plan for what to do in Wisconsin. You know, employees I spoke to talk about being told to figure out something for Foxconn to make in Wisconsin. The big push toward the end of 2018 is just hiring the 260 people they need to get subsidies. No one knows what these people are supposed to do. And by the end of the year, they're just sitting around in this 1960s office building Foxconn has bought as its headquarters in Milwaukee, watching Netflix.
That's this week on Why Is This Happening? Search for Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening right now and subscribe.
We have encountered roadblocks from the political leadership at the Department of Defense and the Office of Management and Budget. Right now, we just aren't getting all the information that we need. And the truth is, many of the agencies that are critical to our security have incurred enormous damage. Many of them have been hollowed out in personnel, capacity, and in morale, in the policy processes that have atrophied or have been sidelined, in the despair of our alliances and the disrepair of those alliances.
That was Joe Biden on Monday, calling out Pentagon officials for their, quote, stonewalling of his incoming administration by those he describes as Trump loyalists. He says adversaries could exploit any confusion during the changing of administrations. Joining us now, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Also with us, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the book, The World, A Brief Introduction, Richard Haass. Admiral, I want to start with you. You have some firsthand experience when it comes to these transitions. And I wanted to get your take on what the president-elect deemed the stonewalling by the Trump administration. Do you agree with his assessment that this is something that could be taken advantage of and exploited by our adversaries? Explain to us why this is so dangerous.
Yeah, the right word, Jonathan, is dangerous. And yes, I've been involved as a senior official working directly for both the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Defense during periods of transition. So I've seen this firsthand. And I'll give you three quick ones. There are tactical problems, operational problems, and strategic problems. So tactically, let's imagine that we see movement on the Korean Peninsula, that intelligence flow, that buildup of information is not available to the Biden team, yet they walk in the door literally January 20th. They're blinded. Secondly, operationally, the decisions being made right now about where to move a carrier strike group, for example, toward the Arabian Gulf. We just moved one in there. We've moved Tomahawk shooting missiles in there. What's the operational rationale behind that? What's the logistics behind that? You don't want to walk in blind to that on January 20th. And then finally, Jonathan, at the strategic level, the incoming team needs to understand at least a snapshot of what the outgoing team is thinking about and how they're connecting the dots on how we face China, for example, in the South China Sea. Freedom of navigation patrols continue. So there are real world consequences here. And I absolutely call on the Pentagon officials who are indeed Trump loyalists, who walked in the door less than a month ago at the very senior levels, including the acting Secretary of Defense. Let's do the right thing here for the nation.
Well, and that brings us, Richard Haass, to one of the top three foreign policy stories you're looking at as we wrap up 2020 and head into 2021. And that is the change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. How do you view all of this from a big picture perspective as it relates to our national security going forward?
It makes it difficult for the new administration to get out of the blocks at the speed you'd like. But these are experienced people. And in places like the Pentagon, you've got the uniformed military, which will still be there after January 20th, is highly professional. So I actually think the new administration there will catch up. I'm actually more worried about areas where they're simply not going to know what was said and done. For example, in U.S.-Russian relations or U.S.-China relations, in the private communications this president had with his counterparts. And one of the big things the Biden administration is going to have to deal with is going to be the reemergence of great power rivalry, above all with China, a China that's far more assertive abroad, far more repressive at home. It's also wealthier. It's coming out of this pandemic in very good shape relative to others. And that, to me, is going to be one of the fundamental challenges facing the Biden administration.
Richard, I want to just drill down a little bit more on China and our relationship there. Our relationship with our allies, if you will, can, I think, be recovered by Biden. But dealing with China, what do you see the biggest challenge Biden faces? Because we're dealing on so many issues. Like you said, there are national security and their aggressiveness, for example, as what they may be doing towards Taiwan. And there's also what their control over Hong Kong. But I also look at the tariffs that were put in place by this administration and the relationship and the stress it caused between the tariffs and the COVID or coronavirus response by this administration and how they blame China. What exactly is Biden walking into, and what would be the first thing he should try and tackle to maybe temper our relationship a little bit?
I actually think the most important thing we could do vis-a-vis China is get ourselves in order. If we're going to compete with China, the United States has to be working on all cylinders. That means getting COVID under control. It means getting the U.S. economy going. It means coming up with a more intelligent immigration policy. Essentially, if we get ourselves sorted out, if we rebuild our relations with our allies, I'm not worried at the end of the day about our ability to compete with China. More fundamentally, though, with China, what we're going to have to figure out, and this will be a challenge for American diplomacy, how do we push back where it will be essential to in the South China Sea, in particular over Taiwan, over their human rights violations, over their theft of intellectual property? How do we push back where we must? At the same time, the relationship does not spill over into direct conflict, and we don't rule out the possibility of cooperating where it's still in our interest to cooperate, for example, on reining in North Korea's nuclear and missile problems. That's going to be a neat and difficult piece of foreign policy.
One of the other challenges on Richard's list is, of course, Iran. And Admiral, I wanted to get your assessment of the situation there. Obviously, tensions are high. We're coming up in a matter of days on the year anniversary of the killing of General Soleimani. And I know there's been concern about possible reciprocity for that. And of course, there is the fate of the JCPOA, too, the nuclear deal. So where do you how things stand with Iran now, and how would you advise the new administration to come in as they inherit, which is a particularly tricky situation left to them by the Trump team?
I'd start not by going to Tehran, but by going to Brussels. And what I mean by that is the most important thing we can do in terms of confronting Iran is to get our allies, our house in order. Our greatest advantage in the world, and I know my good friend Richard would agree with this. And by the way, I have extreme globe envy looking at his 2 globes as opposed to I only have one. Richard would agree, I'm sure, that we need to put our alliances together. And just as we need to do so to construct a strategy to deal with China, and I have always formulated that as with China as confront where we must, cooperate where we can. I think it's a little different in Iran, and therefore we're going to need those allies more than ever. Go to Brussels, get alignment with that team, talk to Ursula von der Leyen, the absolutely marvelous leader of the European Union, construct an approach that gets us back to the negotiating table. We're not going to be able to just parachute back into the JCPOA, in my view. It's going to require another round or 2 of negotiation. That means some carrots have to be offered to the Iranians, but it also means we need to be prepared for some bumpy rides in the Arabian Gulf. That's going to be, in my view, the most complex problem immediately facing this administration.
So, Richard Haass, your top foreign policy story on, I guess, for both of your globes this morning was the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you think that affects our national security and foreign policy over the course of the next year?
On one hand, it really restrains us economically, politically. We simply don't have a lot of bandwidth as a country to act in the world until we get things sorted out at home. So we don't think of health in some ways as a national security issue, Casey. But it really is. Problem is the world's not going to wait. It's not going to say, okay, you Americans, go sort yourself out, and when you're ready, we welcome you back. So things are going to go on. We just talked about Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. So we're going to have to basically deal with our domestic challenge at the same time we deal with the rest of the world. And what we're seeing is the world is coming out of this very unevenly. China is doing quite well. Vietnam is doing well. Several countries in Europe and Asia are doing well. But the United States, Brazil, India, Russia, Iran, and others are doing terribly. And what's so interesting is the countries that are doing well or badly, what doesn't distinguish them is whether they're democracies or authoritarian systems. It's really the quality of the leadership to make smart decisions and then execute them. So what we're going to find out is we're going to inherit, the Biden administration is going to inherit a world very uneven, in many cases very poor, struggling with this public health challenge. At the same time, all the traditional stuff of foreign policy continues to be sitting there on the agenda.
Well, and I have heard Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor, echo what you're saying here, Richard, that it's important to get things together here at home and that focusing on, frankly, our own economic health is the first step toward fixing all of these problems. We should also point out we did not get to quite a few other huge stories on Richard's list. There's Russia and the cyber hack, the Abraham Accords, the Brexit EU deal, unrest in Belarus. So you gentlemen are just going to have to bring your globes back sometime soon so we can talk about everything across the map. Richard Haass and retired Admiral James Stavridis, thank you both for being here on Morning Joe this morning. We really appreciate it. And still ahead here, our next guest says 2020 will be written about in the history books as one of the worst years for workers and their families in American history. We're going to take a look at what happened to the economy this year, coming up next on Morning Joe.
Hi, it's MSNBC's Hayes Brown. You know, these days there's just so much news to wrap your head around, it's challenging to get a deeper understanding of things. So every morning, go beyond the headlines with MSNBC Daily. It features written perspectives from people you know and trust, including Trymaine Lee, Mehdi Hassan, Liz Plank, and Frank Figliuzzi. They'll take you inside the most important issues of our times. Issues like systemic racism, domestic terrorism, and how we can bridge our political divide. Plus, you'll get a fresh take every morning from me. Start your day with MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.